This podcast is brought to you by the American Enterprise Institute.
If you like what you hear, please subscribe, rate, review, and share.
Thanks for listening. Here's our show.
What in the hell's going on?
What the hell is going on?
What the hell is going on?
I don't know what the hell he's talking about.
You don't have to know what the hell is on it.
What the hell's the matter with these guys?
We don't know what's going on.
What the hell's going on?
Who in God's name knows what it's all about?
Hi, I'm Danielle Pletka.
And I'm Mark Thiessen.
Welcome to our podcast, What the Hell is Going On? Mark, what the hell is going on?
What the hell is going on is Donald Trump is in the courtroom in New York City. He is on trial by Alvin Bragg for supposed campaign finance violations. This is one set of charges out of a set of 91 indictments, or I guess not 91 indictments, 91 charges at the federal, state, and local level, which compares to Charles Manson, who had 10. So if you want a sense of proportion. But, you are our resident not Trump Republican on this podcast. I'm a little bit more open to Trump than you are. So I'd like your take on this. Because I think you're as outraged by in many ways, by the lawfare that's being waged here as I am. But, rather than me rant, let's hear from
comes
Daniel.
later.
What do you think?
Let me rant. So it is really interesting, Mark, because I think that the phenomenon that's occurring with this trial is not what was intended by its prosecutors. So no question that when Democrats thought about who they wanted to go up against the weakest president in history, Joe Biden, they wanted Donald Trump, the second weakest president in history. And we've gone over that repeatedly on the podcast. And so elevating him through these charges, through everything else, I think was part of the plan. But I think that everybody who is involved thought that they would be able to deliver the coup de grace before the election, right? Look at this damaged piece of goods, convicted, potentially, presiding over the White House from prison in Georgia or New York or somewhere, right? And that is not the effect that it's having. Even among people, and everybody will hear later when we're talking to our guest how I feel about how Donald Trump is behaving, even in the face of these charges. The bottom line is that the charges are so ridiculous. There's such a perversion of the law, and it's offensive to anybody who believes in rule of law. So one of the things that offended so many of us during the Trump administration was his desire to pick up the phone and say, "Find me the votes." And it's like, dude, what? You're not Fidel Castro. We're not finding you votes, right? But this is exactly what his opponents have done, is that they have taken the law and made a mockery of it. And in the case of the Stormy Daniels trial, it is simple enough that people can understand, right? Because, a lot of these things are actually pretty complicated. They're hard to understand. They're recondite pieces of law. But this is, you misbooked a charge for your company. You didn't steal anything. Right? You didn't do anything bad, but you misbooked a charge for the company in order to pay off somebody who you were almost certainly trying to hush up, not for reasons of the election, but because you were screwing around while your wife was pregnant, because you're a pig, right? And we are going to charge you with election fraud for that. I'm sorry, what? So, really long answer, but that's how I feel about it. I feel like the law is being perverted for ends that are not decent or good.
Yeah, so Donald Trump is essentially being prosecuted for running for president. Like, if he wasn't running for president, almost none of these cases would have been brought, these 91 charges. The idea that you can be charged for suppressing a bad news story, even about your sex life. I'm sorry, what about Bill Clinton and the bimbo eruptions? Unlike Trump, who just paid these women off, Clinton actually, I went back and looked at this. He hired a team of lawyers to comb through these women's personal lives and to find former sex partners who would testify against them and speak out against them and destroy their characters and all that. How is that better than a hush money payment? And Joe Biden, who lied to the American people about the Hunter Biden laptop, said it was Russian disinformation. Complete, and then had the entire media establishment and social media establishment help him suppress the story because it would have hurt him in the election. Is that not suppressing a negative news story? I mean, it's just a different technique. So the idea that somehow suppressing a negative news story is a crime, I mean, it's just, and again, John will walk us through the court of law and the legal aspects of this case. But in the court of public opinion in the presidency, this is helping Donald Trump because two things. One, it's keeping him in the courtroom where he can't go out and say things that are again that are hurting him with the voters. And two, it's giving him the moral high ground because he can say, I mean, it's pretty hard to take somebody who slept with a porn star while his wife was pregnant and give him the moral high ground, but they're doing it, and he can go out and say correctly that he is the victim of lawfare. He is a victim of malicious prosecution. It's election interference. He says that all the time. 100% it's election interference. It's an effort to try. This is all an effort to try and stop him from winning the presidency. It has nothing to do with the substance of the cases, and that goes down in most of these cases. Wait
a minute. No, it doesn't.
Yeah,
okay,
it does.
The classified documents case, dead to rights.
No, I'm sorry, Danny. Hold on. The special counsel just cleared Joe Biden of the exact same charge as Donald Trump is accused of, the same underlying crime. You can put aside the issue of interfering with the investigation, but the underlying crime is the exact same charge. And there would not be an interference case if there wasn't for the underlying charge. He cleared him because Joe Biden is too old and senile to be prosecuted for it. And so how do you charge Donald Trump for the exact same underlying crime? In fact, worse under Joe Biden's case, because Joe Biden was never had declassification authority. He took documents out of the Senate SCIF and took them home. You and I both worked in the Senate for years. We know you can't do that. He took them as vice president. Danny.
Just because Donald Trump is being prosecuted and Joe Biden isn't, doesn't make these crimes any the less. Okay?
Fine, but
and he engaged in them. So yes, the answer to that is Joe Biden should have been prosecuted, not that Donald Trump.
Okay, but he's not. But he's not. So when you look at this from a political standpoint, because you have to look at it through the political lens, because it's being prosecuted through a political lens, and the decisions to charge or not charge are being made through a political lens, they cleared, in the court of public opinion, they are not prosecuting Joe Biden for the same crime that they are prosecuting Donald Trump for. How is that fair?
First of all, fair is not how anything works.
Thank you.
That's not the word we're looking for. That's not the word we're looking for. What we are looking for is to understand whether there is any validity to the underlying charges, okay? Did Donald Trump try to suborn electors in Georgia? Well, we pretty much heard him on the telephone trying to do that, so I think so. Did he, in fact, both take classified documents and then interfere with the investigation? Also, both. Those are crimes. And I think when we start to try to diminish them because of, with whataboutist claims, then what we diminish our own arguments against the bullshit charges against him, like the ones in New York, and frankly, for the most part, the ones in Washington, D.C. So again, that's you asked me what I think. That's what I think, and I'm never going to slide down that
Pandora's box.
I guess
You're absolutely right.
There you
I
go.
made the mistake of asking you what you think.
There you go. Maybe we should both hear what John Yoo thinks.
That's a great idea.
John is a repeat offender on our podcast, and everybody knows why. He's awesome. He is the Emanuel Heller Professor of Law at the University of California at Berkeley. He is a non-resident senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, a fine public policy research institution in Washington. And he's a visiting fellow at the Hoover Institution in Stanford, a less fine public policy research institution on the left coast. Hugh was a law clerk for Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas. He was the general counsel of the Senate Judiciary Committee. He's the former head of the Office of Legal Counsel. Basically, he knows everything about it. Plus, he has a really great book out. And Mark, I don't know if you have this one, but I love it, called The Politically Incorrect Guide to the Supreme Court, which he wrote with Robert Delahunty. So a perfect guest to solve all of the disagreements between me and Mark.
And along with Mike Gallagher, one of the biggest recidivist guests on this show. So we love to have him on. And here's our interview. John, welcome back to the podcast.
Thanks, guys. And before you ask, I want you to know that I have never drafted a hush money NDA in my life. But I'm willing to start learning.
Danny needs one, so he'll be
need
talking
it.
to her.
You never know what's going on in the back corners of the what the hell.
So let's talk about this case in New York. So I didn't know that suppressing a bad news story was a crime, John. Is it?
If it is, then I think Tony Blinken and all those guys who wrote about Hunter Biden's laptop being disinformation, better lawyer up.
Or the bimbo eruptions, right?
Yeah, Bill Clinton. Exactly. This is the thing. And this is really why there's really no legal merit to this prosecution going on in New York City. Oh, I should have said also, guys, great to be with you again. Although this is a weird occasion to talk about these kind of sordid affairs, I'd rather talk about like disqualification again or, weighty matters about the 14th Amendment, but I'm happy to crawl through the mud with you guys. So
excellent.
It's where we feel best.
If you're gonna crawl through the mud, at least make a lawyer go with you and show you the route.
Hey, what are you talking about? Lawyers take us there.
Exactly. So this is the problem why the case doesn't really have legal merit. Is none of these actions are themselves illegal. Paying people to for non-disclosure agreements is not illegal. Trying to combat negative news stories is not illegal. The only thing that Alvin Bragg here in this New York case claims is illegal is that Trump listed the payments for the NDAs under the wrong heading in his own corporate books, and that it should have been. So that's one. And then he says, that allows me to claim that the whole thing was actually a campaign contribution that Trump made to himself, but didn't report. And that's a felony. And so now Trump should go to jail for things which it sounds like we've learned. This is the other thing interesting learned from the trial is how all these celebrities do this left and right, using the National Enquirer and similar newspapers and magazines to pay people off to stop saying bad things about them.
It's really confusing, and actually, I wanna walk our listeners backwards for a second. So
You
we've
do that
talked
every
about.
time.
Thank you, Mark.
Ouch.
Thank you. Now, seriously. So I want people to understand this because this actually is a really, really contorted bit of legal wrangling on the part of Alvin Bragg, right? So what has he said? He has said that Donald Trump gave a payoff to Stormy Daniels. The payoff, hush money payoff in and of itself wasn't illegal. He miscategorized it. And because he miscategorized it, Bragg says, fraudulently, that is a violation, not of New York state tax law, because he hasn't been charged under that, not of New York state financial regs, because he hasn't been charged under that, but that it was an illegal campaign donation that he did not fess up to. Now, John, correct me if I'm wrong in any part of this, but isn't that a federal charge, not a New York state charge? Help us understand how Bragg built this house of cards.
Yes, in fact, I repeat this too often on your podcast. This brings us all back to the wisdom of Justice Antonin Scalia or Justice Clarence Thomas. Because they have said in opinions that have nothing to do with this, but have made clear that only the federal government can prosecute violations of federal law, and only state governments can prosecute violations of state law. And the reason why, they say, is because if there are state officials out there running around charging people for violating federal election law, well, the president can't tell them to stop if he doesn't want them to go ahead, because the president can't fire state officials. So these are charges, Danny, that are these campaign contribution charges were looked at by the Justice Department. And mind you, the Biden Justice Department these days is grasping for any straws they can find to go after Trump. And the Federal Elections Commission looked at this, and they decided Trump committed they decided there's no case they could bring. There's no prosecution. Nevertheless, Bragg then comes in and says, I want to charge a violation of federal law, but I can't do it constitutionally. So instead what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, Trump violated New York bookkeeping law, and the New York bookkeeping law he violated allegedly is he cooked his own books to commit some other crime. That's actually the New York crime. And that other crime, though, happens to be federal election law. I mean, it sounds complicated, but what he's really doing is he's trying to really step in the foot of Merrick Garland or Jack Smith. He doesn't feel like they've done their job.
Can I just clarify something with you? If my state of Virginia, God forbid, wanted to charge me with violating state law for the purpose of violating federal law, would I need to have been charged with a violation of federal law? Or can my state simply, just taking Donald Trump out of this, can my state simply assume a crime for which I have not been charged out of whole cloth, and then at the state level charge me with conspiracy or with fraud for having tried to violate that federal law?
Danny, this is a great question. This is a great question.
You'd have to be convicted of the federal crime in order to do that,
Yes.
right?
Not only is this a great question, but the Biden administration has already explained this to us in the immigration context. Remember what they're arguing against Governor Abbott in Texas. Texas has said we're allowed to detain illegal aliens who are here in violation of federal immigration law, right? That's exactly what you're talking about, Danny. Can a state say, we're going to grab you because you're violating the federal government's law? And the Biden administration is litigating up and down all the way to the Supreme Court saying, no, that violates Justice Scalia and Justice Thomas's rule that only the federal government can charge you with a violation of federal law. So Alvin Bragg is making an argument that runs directly counter to the position the Biden administration is taking in the immigration cases with Texas. The exact example that you're talking about, Danny.
So why is Abbott right and Bragg is wrong?
I actually think Abbott's wrong.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I mean, under existing law, Abbott's wrong. That's what he's doing. He's going to the Supreme Court to try to change the rule, but I think he's going to lose.
Explain why you think Abbott's wrong.
Why Abbott's under existing law, under Justice Scalia's precedent, which actually the Biden administration is waving up and down every time these cases appear, is that a state can't try to secretly take over the job of the Justice Department or the federal government right? Because they're not allowed to enforce federal law. You know, that a state officer is not allowed to arrest you or me, well, maybe Mark, but not you or me for violating federal law.
Exactly.
Right? So you can't cheat on that by saying, well, if you violate federal law, that's also a violation of state law too, right? You can't just sort of piggyback on top. Because if you did that, you could, right, Texas could pass a law saying, or New York City could pass a law saying, all violations of federal law are also violations of New York law or Texas law. And we'll just take over the job of the federal government in our state. Now, you can say, why can't they do that? And that's Justice Scalia's point is, and you guys will love this as I do, this is the unitary executive reappears. The evil Dick Cheney unitary executive. So the deeper theory behind it is only the president under the Constitution has the responsibility to enforce the law of the federal government. And so Scalia said if governors and DAs are running around enforcing federal law, that seizes that power from the president. The president can't control them. And if he can't control them, he can't, live up to his constitutional duty.
One of the things that is really interesting to me about this is actually something I've been thinking about a lot in the scope of Congress, which is that both the White House and the legislative branch have really lost interest in defending their prerogatives. It used to be that even when a Republican president did something that we agreed with on Capitol Hill, but that was usurping our prerogative, we would say, dude, no, you can't do that, right? Ditto for the White House. And now all of that has just gone by the wayside. Rule of law has just become an afterthought, subjugated to, political whims of the day. It's really bizarre.
It's a bigger picture that I actually gain all the time when I listen to your guys' podcast, because you guys go through this in lots of other areas where this has happened with the Biden administration, is they see Trump as such a threat to the democracy, such a threat to the Constitution or the political order, that they're willing to waive all normal, right, institutional arrangements and rules in order to get him. And the problem with that is And I think you saw that in the oral arguments about whether President Trump has immunity in the Supreme Court last week, is what we ought to worry about is what is the future incentive that this is going to place on future presidents, on future Congresses. Once, as you say, Danny, you tear down these institutional walls and these delineations about who's supposed to do what in our government, and you just throw it all at Trump because he's such a bad man, you're going to ruin these institutions and rules for everyone else in the future.
And by the way, John, this works also in international relations. I still remember this, and it's a really old example, but it's a really important one. For years on end, George H.W. Bush, so we're really talking about ancient history here, refused to enforce a law that imposed sanctions on Pakistan if they developed a nuclear weapon. And the reason was Pakistan was helping us defeat the Soviets in Afghanistan. Well, okay. But he was illegally applying the waiver because they did have a nuclear weapon. As soon as Pakistan stopped being useful to us, he imposed all the sanctions required under the law. And the Pakistanis kind of turned to us and they were like, I don't understand. Is it law or is it policy? And the answer is it's law, but it's being applied as if it's policy. That just means that all over the world, people don't know what the bright red lines are that delineate what they can and can't do. It's not just in the United States.
Yeah, I think that's right, Danny. I think in some ways it's even more, well, not more, but equally damaging to us in foreign policy if people hear messages from us in our laws and then they just see them ignored or waived.
Bingo.
And they're going to never take seriously any message we send.
That's right.
Yeah, so, John, the other thing about this case that is angering a lot of people is the gag order, right? So Donald Trump is a candidate for president of the United States, and he's been told that he can't talk about any of these things. So people, and some of the tweets that he's like been fined for were responding to other people attacking him. So how is it that like a candidate for president is supposed to be allowed to be attacked publicly by people over this case, and he can't respond and defend his name? So he can't defend himself in the court of public opinion while he's defending himself in the court of law. How is that constitutional?
Now, I think ultimately higher courts will find parts of the gag order unconstitutional, but it shows how over his head this judge is, because he's treating this like this is just a regular criminal trial of some drug dealer or some organized crime figure. And in those cases, we do allow the Trump. Yeah, exactly. Maybe, yeah. And so he's treating it like, oh, this is a defendant who's going to try to coerce or intimidate witnesses. And then we do allow First Amendment rights to be restricted in that case. But that totally ignores the core purpose of the free speech clause, which is for all of us to engage in political speech that's relevant to picking our elected representatives. That's the founders. That's the key part of the free speech clause, was not to protect nude dancing or, crosses and urine exhibits. It was to make sure we could speak about elections and candidates. And the gag order is preventing Trump from doing that, adding information for all of us to use when we choose who to vote for.
Wait, hang on a second. Okay. I mean, yes, I agree with you, and I understand this is an invidious sort of a problem. On the other hand, Trump has gone well beyond talking about the facts and merits of the case and over to talking about the judge's family, the court stenographer's family, the jurors. Any normal, and I use that word advisedly, any normal defendant wouldn't engage in that kind of garbage. And it is garbage. Let's agree. He is not talking about Alvin Bragg outrage and the merits of this case, or even talking about Stormy Daniels and the garbage behind that. He is personally attacking the judge and employees of the court. I don't know of any judge that would stand for that. And accepting hey, hang on a second. Let the lawyer answer.
That you almost never hear.
You like that, young lady?
Let the lawyer talk.
Who the hell do you think you are?
No, I totally...
John tell you why you're wrong.
No, so I totally agree with Danny that in a normal criminal case, this gag order would not be unusual. The defendant would not be able to do what Donald Trump is doing. The only thing that really makes it different is that he's also the major presidential candidate in the opposition party right now, right? He is the leading alternative to the incumbent political party. And there, I think the founders wanted free speech, to be the broadest and most protected. And so that's why I think this judge is just so overzealous. Right? This judge is not someone who sits there and thinks about constitutional issues all day. He's a guy who just makes sure trials run on time, and he doesn't understand these important dimensions because this is a first of its kind case. Can I say the second thing is that we wouldn't have to face any of this if the DA here, just like the Justice Department in other cases, hasn't taken the unprecedented step of prosecuting a former president. That's why we've never had to think about these issues and these conflicts before, because we've never had a former president prosecute. So this is the bigger message I wanted to leave you with was, we're all focusing on the courts and on judges, and in a way that distracts us from the real responsibility for this. I think in this case, in the Muni case, in the special counsel case, it's Joe Biden and the Biden administration and these DAs have chosen to cross the Rubicon of prosecuting a former president. And so that's why we're getting all these issues like Danny's talking about for the first time ever that we have no precedents on. We have no real answers on because we've never faced it before. But it's not because of the courts. It's not the court's fault that we haven't faced it before. It's because we have an absence, I think, of statesmanship and good judgment, and we're letting the law take over.
John, before we get off the New York case, I do want to ask you about one thing that I find really interesting. Andy McCarthy had a good piece on May 2nd in National Review, and he made the argument that because of the nature of Judge Merchan's rulings, the Trump defense team in New York was basically not going to be able to make the necessary kind of defense. In other words, they have, instead of being able to say nothing they did was illegal, Andy argues, he says that because of Merchan's rulings accepting implicitly that the NDA was somehow illegal, they are being forced into saying that in fact it was all Michael Cohen's fault, Trump's lawyer. Can you just explain that a little to people? Because I think it's really important, less obviously for the day-to-day and more for what we're going to ultimately see as probably a guilty ruling.
Yeah. So first, the reason why the Trump lawyers have to do this is because of what we talked about in the beginning. They would rather fight this out on the grounds that we just mentioned, right? That the DA here has no power to enforce election law. But because Judge Merchan has rejected all those immediately, they have to now fight, this is now like trench warfare. Everything that the DA does, they have to respond to. The natural lawyer's defense is always going to be, I'm just going to attack and poke at the prosecution. They have to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that all these facts are true. But the reason they're doing that is because Judge Merchan has removed their ability to make any legal arguments. He has accepted this legal theory that the DA has put out. So all that Trump's lawyers can do now is just try to prove that the facts don't bear this weird, I think, unconstitutional theory of prosecution. But I think you're right, Danny. That means that the prosecution has the advantage. All they have to show here, right, is that Trump, ordered the payoff of these women for non-disclosure agreements and that he mischaracterized the bookkeeping. All the prosecution now has to prove is that those facts are true. And even though the testimony that we're watching every day shows that Trump didn't want these stories out, that he found them embarrassing, you're also hearing witnesses say, yeah, because we're in the middle of a campaign, and it would damage the campaign. That's all the prosecution needs to do to win under their theory.
So do you think they're going to win? And also, does the judge's decision to reject those arguments give them a grounds for appeal?
Oh, yeah. So I could easily see the case being reversed on appeal. It should be reversed on appeal. It might have to go to the U.S. Supreme Court to be reversed on appeal. But all that's going to be too late for Trump. Right, you're talking appeals take years, right? What solace is it going to be to Trump a year from now if the New York Court of Appeals, it's called, reverses the judge on this, or the U.S. Supreme Court 2 years from now gets this case and says, we are with Scalia and Cheney, we're going to reverse this prosecution. So actually, the prosecution is doing pretty well putting the facts together. The one thing you can't predict is all Trump needs is one juror out of the 12 to say, I disagree. Because you have to have a unanimous jury to get a conviction.
So how does this impact him presidentially? So this is a state prosecution, so it's not going to stop him from running for president. If he gets elected, he can't pardon himself from a state crime. So how does this impact Trump going forward?
This is your guys' expertise. I don't know squat about elections. This is you tell me. But if I were to to be provocative,
politically, I mean legally.
Oh, legally. Oh, that's easy. Yeah. The politics are hard. The law is easy. So, okay. So if Trump loses the election, right, then, it'll just go forward and maybe then he will want to win on appeal a year from now or 2 years from now. Interesting question is, what if Trump wins? So this is going to drag us back. It's like Michael Corleone in Godfather 3. Every time we try to get away from the Clintons, they pull us back in. Because guess what the leading precedent on this issue is? Clinton versus Paula Jones. That's the only case out there that tells us what happens when a sitting president is being prosecuted or sued for things that don't involve his presidency while he's in office. While he's in office, he's, as you said, Mark, he's free from federal prosecution. The minute he gets into office, he can fire Jack Smith. The minute he's in office, he can pardon himself of the special counsel investigation. But the pardon clause doesn't extend to state crimes, as you say. And Trump's control over the Justice Department doesn't give him control over DAs. And so those cases can go forward. The DA case in Georgia with, Fani Willis, who I call the real prosecutors of Atlanta down there. And then I've got that copyrighted. I'm writing a miniseries about a reality show about this. And then, right, the DA in New York, Trump can't control them as the president. And so Clinton versus Paula Jones talks about how they're allowed to go forward. You just have to schedule it well so that it doesn't interfere with the president's duties. I don't know how you do that. I'm sure Trump will say, please defer these until after I'm out of office. That's what Clinton tried to do, but the Supreme Court said no in the Jones case.
So before we allow you to get away from us, let's talk a little bit about the Supreme Court case and the immunity. Tell us what you're thinking about that and what impact it will have on the various charges that are around there, Jack Smith, but also others.
I am really surprised how well Trump did at the oral arguments at the court. And this is why. If you expected the court to follow the method to interpreting the Constitution and followed in the Dobbs case, which overturned Roe versus Wade, or any of the normal constitutional cases, Trump should lose. Because the court has said we look at the text, there's no immunity for presidents in the text. The constitutional history, Alexander Hamilton has a Federalist paper which says the direct opposite of what Trump's saying. He says, Hamilton basically says, after you leave office, even if you're the president, you can be prosecuted for crimes you committed in office. So I can't see how the conservative justices would write the opinion saying Trump has immunity if they followed what they've done in cases like the Second Amendment, cases like abortion. But when you listen to the oral argument, 90% of the oral argument was on the grounds that Trump wanted, is it a good idea to have presidential immunity? How would we limit presidential immunity and make sure it only applied to the right things? Nobody was talking, except for a few questions, about does the immunity even exist? It's almost as if the justices had already assumed what Trump wanted them to assume. Now,
why do you think that? Why do you think that is? Especially, you know these guys. You know Clarence Thomas. You clerked in the court. Is it politics affecting the conservatives, or what's going on?
I don't think it's partisan politics. What I think, and there are good conservatives who are taking this view. They're worried think about the incentives on future presidents. What if every president, we've worked in politics. We know that elected leaders have to make tough calls under the pressure of circumstance that involve the safety of the nation. What if they have to worry about being prosecuted? Most of the discussion, I think for good reason, was this could really distort the way not Trump makes a decision or Biden, but the presidents after him. Do we want them to worry about being prosecuted when they order a drone strike? What if we make them like the mistake that was made in the Afghanistan withdrawal? So I think that the justices, I don't think it's a wise thing to do, but they're falling into this trap, I think, of trying to fix the Constitution. Because everyone, I think, says it would be a better idea for presidents not to prosecute each other. Even though the constitutional text doesn't say that there's that prohibition, we might read it in for good government.
So you think that that Joe Biden could be prosecuted for the drone strike in Afghanistan?
So this
Should be allowed to be prosecuted for that?
So this is the legalese about it. So immunity only means that the president can't be prosecuted at all. Once you're prosecuted, then you can still challenge the charges. Like you could still say, as I think Biden could, I was exercising my commander-in-chief power, and Congress can't try to restrict my commander-in-chief power with criminal laws. I think Trump can say, and even if he loses immunity, he can say, well, these charges are unconstitutional. I can't be charged with fraud, right, against the United States. I can't be charged with obstruction. The facts don't fit what I did. Immunity just means you can't drag someone into court at all in the first place, that you're immune from the courts. That I think is so broad that you don't need to have that, but you can still have a functional, constitutional system where presidents can still challenge the charges against him. In fact, I don't think any of Jack Smith's charges actually work here.
So before we let you go, what can you just walk us through? So everybody's focused on the New York case and the Supreme Court cases. They've just been in the news. But what's left? What's the legal landscape going between now and November election? Where are all these different cases? How many are going to get tried? Where I think it's 91 charges against him at the federal, state, and local level. How many of those are actually going to get litigated? Where's it all going?
So you can see the reason we are paying a lot of attention to this New York case, not just because it's first, but it's going to get done. One thing we should all realize, I hope everyone has learned this from watching what's going on, a trial judge is the king or queen of their courtroom. What they say goes. And if Judge Merchan wants this tried and gets to verdict fast, it's going to get done, and it's going to get done fast. And I'm sure we're going to get a verdict, before the conventions, easily before the conventions. Trump is a lucky guy in a weird way, in a bad lucky way. He's bad lucky in the sense that this is the weakest of all the charges. This is the most frivolous of all the cases. And so the most important case is the January 6th prosecution by Jack Smith for essentially fomenting, if not conspiring, to stop the electoral count and stop Congress from executing its constitutional duties. That one will really depend on when the Supreme Court gets its immunity case out and what it says. The Supreme Court could force that case to be punted past the election. The Supreme Court in its immunity case could also give the prosecution, the trial court, the grounds to accelerate the case and get it done before the election. The other two cases, it doesn't look. You can see the one in Georgia, which claims that Trump's reelection campaign was an organized crime operation. That one is imploding, right? I want to see more testimony from Fani Willis and her boyfriend. I'm bored right now. I need to see more of this. But that one has imploded. I don't think there's no trial date even set for that case now because it's been such a disaster. And the last one, which actually would have been the easiest one for Jack Smith to prove, which is the classified documents case, no trial date set in that either. So the real threat to Trump is the case in which he's claiming immunity at the Supreme Court. Because that could be the most devastating on the subject. There's still time maybe for it to get done before the election.
Well, talk to us about that case. If that goes forward, I mean, is Trump in trouble?
Yeah.
Is it?
Yes.
Do you think that the crime is that he committed a crime? Give us your analysis of that case.
So one thing I just want to just a small not partisan point, but good justice point that was told to me by our common friend and my former judge, Judge Larry Silberman. So he was Deputy Attorney General during the Watergate years, and one thing he impressed on me was, if you're the Justice Department, no one should ever be out there accusing anybody of committing a federal crime if you can't prove it. The job of the prosecutor is just to go after crimes because a prosecutor is so powerful they can destroy anybody's reputation just by saying things about them without going to court. So notice what the Biden administration is doing, which violates this rule, which is Joe Biden, who's the head of the executive branch, responsible for all prosecutions of federal law, is out there saying Trump has committed insurrection. Right? He's out there saying it repeatedly. His special counsel is not charging Trump with insurrection. He could charge Trump with insurrection. If he had improved it, Trump could be disqualified in every ballot in the country. He would have to be disqualified, actually. But for some reason, Jack Smith has charged Trump with these white-collar crime laws that we usually charge defense contractors or Medicare fraudsters with. He's charged Trump with committing fraud against the United States. I think that's going to lose. The Supreme Court has said usually that crime can't be used against politicians. unless they're taking bribes. Trump's done a lot of things on January 6th, but he wasn't taking a bribe. The second...
No, he didn't need to be paid to do something so stupid.
Yeah, that's a
But I
good
think
point.
it's
Yeah.
important. Right. I think the point you're making is hugely important and goes back to what we were talking about when Mark was reconnecting, which is that at the end of the day, these standards and precedents and laws are meaningless in the pursuit of what these individuals, and I really mean that, individuals have assessed is the higher good. Jack Smith is doing this and throwing whatever he thinks will stick at Donald Trump because Donald Trump must be stopped at all costs. And of course, the most telling thing was what you said, which is what would have been the killer? What was the killer charge? The killer charge was insurrection. Half of America already believes Donald Trump tried to exhort an insurrection, and yet those were not the charges. So we have to believe that if Jack Smith could have done it, he would have done it. But it was so legally distant from him that even he I guess he needed Alvin Bragg, even he could not find his way through the maze of ethics and law in order to get to that point. I mean, isn't that what we should assume?
Yeah, I think that if you were going to take this, terrible step of, for the first time in our history, going after a former president and saying publicly they committed insurrection, then you better have the charges buttoned up. You better have all the facts settled, down to a T. This should be the most uncontroversial prosecution ever because you got to win. And you can't be pushing the boundaries of the law. You can't be infringing on the rights of defendants in new ways. It should be unexceptional. And instead, Jack Smith, what he's done is as you're saying, he's contorting the law. He's pushing it beyond its normal boundaries. That's why Jack Smith lost 9-0 the last time he was at the Supreme Court when he went after Governor McDonnell under another crazy theory. This is his MO. He's done this before. But your point, Danny, I agree with. We're all being harmed as a country because, and this reminds me of Man for All Seasons, right? When Sir Thomas More is talking to this young lawyer, and the young lawyer says, "I would do anything to get the devil. I would chop down every tree of the law to get the devil." He says, "I would." And Sir Thomas More says, "Would you chop down a whole forest to get the devil?" And the young lawyer says, "Yes, I would." And then More says, "Well, what happens when the devil turns around then? You have no trees to hide behind. The law is gone. You have no more protections." And that's right. It's we're living that out right now. Not that I'm trying to set up, Thiessen here to give us some Catholic learning now, but
Donald Trump is Thomas More. There you go.
Oh, please.
Yeah.
Please.
Actually, in that story, he's the devil.
Oh, there you go. All right.
That's exactly right.
Let's drag you into politics for my exit question. So you've said that these legal setbacks are actually political gold for Donald Trump. It seems to me like these are things that should be litigated in the court of public opinion, not in the court of law, and that it is fair game for Joe Biden to campaign by saying Trump committed insurrection and let the American people judge whether or not he's worthy of the Oval Office. He's now, because they're litigating this in the court of law, Trump can, I think, correctly say he's being persecuted and by a politicized justice system that is using lawfare against him. And he's turned what should be a negative for him in the campaign into a positive, which is that people don't think that this is wrong. We've never had a presidential candidate indicted before. Former president indicted before. Now we got 91. I mean, it almost like makes the ad for itself. Hasn't this helped him?
No, this is the weird thing about Trump is he has the ability to perform this kind of legal political jujitsu. He is suffering. Right, you would normally think if you were his lawyer, you would say this is a disaster. Right, this is a total disaster. We are getting hammered in 4 courtrooms simultaneously. I mean, this is the worst. I can't even think of a defendant who's been under this kind of attack. Somehow he flipped it over into political benefit, right? The CNN poll has him 6 points ahead nationwide amongst registered voters. But here's the cynic in me. You guys tell me what you think, because we've all been aides in the Senate, right? So if you were giving your boss advice about what to say or not say, this is the funny thing. I think the gag order and the criminal trial is actually like the best PR advice to force Trump to not talk about all his crazy ideas that people are afraid of on every other you don't hear him saying, I'm going to be an autocrat for a day now, right? You don't hear him talking about taking revenge on people. All his public statements are focused on an issue that's resonating with the American people, which is the justice system is being perverted to persecute a guy. A lot of people can sympathize with that. And right, that's why I think it's political gold for him.
I think you are exactly right. I think it has two benefits. The one is that it shuts him up, right? It does the equivalent of put Joe Biden back in his basement. Donald Trump, who is in many ways his own worst enemy, it limits his ability to be out there using the bully pulpit to say dumb shit, which is obviously always his wont. That's number one. But number two is, it was really interesting. I had this conversation last week on Meet the Press, and we were on with a pollster. We were talking about a focus group, and they were talking about whether people would vote based on what's happening on campuses and all the anti-Semitism and everything else. And I said, look, none of that affects how people vote, but if it underscores the sense that people have that everything is just falling apart, right? That our institutions don't work for us anymore, that government doesn't help us anymore, that nobody is prosecuting, criminals or illegal immigrants, that nobody's doing anything about inflation or crime, then all of a sudden that's bad news for Joe Biden. And oddly enough, I think that this underscores that we kind of have lost our grip on government. It's no longer serving us. It's serving the whims and demands of elites, and it has to be fixed. And that's a vote for Donald Trump.
Yes, this is the 1968 election all over again.
Absolutely.
How did the Democrats not see this? And so Donald Trump, in his these weird, like mini press conferences Trump is having when he walks into the courtroom, out of the courtroom, he doesn't have to even promote an agenda. It's part of turning this election into, this is just a referendum on the incumbent. Look what that incumbent's doing to me. Bad things to me, just like he's doing bad things to all of you.
Right. I think that's exactly right. And a perfect place to end. Thank you for putting up with Mark and for joining me, who you love. And it's always so great to have you. I really just what can I say? Love you, John.
So Danny, what'd you think?
So John and I had a really interesting conversation when you were having some technical difficulties just about the sort of the general decay in the rule of law and not just the lack of interest by American constitutional institutions like the Congress and the executive to protect their own prerogatives, but also this notion that the rule of law and the letter of the law should be set aside for the higher good of quote unquote protecting democracy, whatever that means, against an enemy that is so terrible that the American people must simply be ignored in their wishes to promote him to the White House. And it just strikes me, when Donald Trump was president, his opponents and enemies said that in addition to the crimes that he was committing in office, he was damaging American foreign policy because he was suggesting to foreign autocrats that the law was meaningless, that they could go after their opponents without compunction, without being restrained by the rule of law or constitutions or Magna Cartas or whatever else it is that foreign countries have, because that's what Donald Trump did, and we're the greatest democracy in the world, and if we do something bad, they feel it's license for them to do something bad. I think that the Democrats are guilty of exactly that same charge, right? When we see the Georgian government going against its opponents, Putin going against his opponents, Erdogan going against his opponents, all around the world we see autocrats feeling that they have license to throw their opponents in jail, to exterminate them, extrajudicial killings. This is actually a lesson that the Democrats are teaching them. You define what the higher good is, and then you go ahead and do it because it's more important than the law on a day-to-day basis. The fact that they don't see that is outrageous to me.
So you have peeled back yet another layer in the onion of left-wing hypocrisy when it comes to Donald Trump. I had not thought of that particular angle. I have long been concerned that the left's approach to Donald Trump is that we need to burn down our democracy in order to save it. Right? That we need to, that Donald Trump is such a unique threat to our freedoms and our system that we need to burn the system down, do anything goes in order to stop him from coming back to the White House. And the truth be told, I think that is a bigger threat than a second Trump term. If you think about January 6th, there was no chance, I don't think that there was any chance that Donald Trump was going to succeed in staying in the presidency, right? All the checks and balances our institutions held, right? All the courts, including Trump-appointed judges, ruled against him. The state legislatures didn't do what he asked them to do, including he brought those Michigan legislative officials to the White House, and they said, "It's so great to meet with you." Yeah, no, we're not doing that, right? The Congress did its job. The vice president did his job. If any one of those had not done their jobs, there were fail-safes to stop him from assuming the presidency. There was no way that he was going to succeed in an insurrection or a coup against the United States. On the other hand, what the Democrats are trying to do is burn down the guardrails and the institutions, right? So we're going to take the justice system and weaponize it against him in order to stop him. We're going to file civil suits to bankrupt him for the crime of running for president. We're going to try and use the 14th Amendment to kick him off the ballot, even though he hasn't been convicted of insurrection or even charged with insurrection, as you point out in our interview. And once we take back the Senate, if we win the election, because Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema won't be there anymore, we're going to get rid of the filibuster so that we can pack the Senate with 2 or 4 more Democratic senators, and we can pack the courts with judges who agree with us, who are going to uphold us. And we're going to do all these things because we're saving democracy. No, you're not. And I hadn't even thought about the example that sets until you raised it for foreign autocrats. They're saying, hey, if America can do it, so can we. So, I mean, I just think that all of the attempt to stop Trump is so much more dangerous than Trump himself. And that's one of the reasons why, and it's all on top of that, they're making Trump's election more likely because people are disgusted by this. People are, in the 2022 midterms, they used the strategy of funding the MAGA candidates in GOP primaries in order to get them, because they'd be easier to beat. They tried to just do that to Brian Fitzpatrick. A bunch of Democrats tried to do that, who's one of the best moderate bipartisan members of Congress in the Republican Party, and they tried to knock him out. Because we've got to save the Republic from MAGA Republicans, but let's nominate a bunch of MAGA Republicans because they're easier to beat. Now they're doing it to Trump with lawfare, and they're trying to do it through the legal system, and it's disgusting. And I think a lot of people who might not necessarily think that they want to elect Donald Trump might just elect him because of it. Might just not I think the outrage over this has surpassed people's memory and their outrage of January 6th.
Well, I think that's exactly, and all the polling tells you that. And of course, I mean, you can't tease out the economy, illegal immigration, crime. You can't tease those things out. But I think you're exactly right. People remember Donald Trump's presidency with COVID, right? They remember that more fondly and rate his presidency higher than Joe Biden's. That, for me, if I'm Joe Biden, but you know something, Mark? None of these people are capable of taking a step back and saying, what the hell are we doing? Is it good for the country? Is it good for the future of the nation? Is it good for America? They're not interested in doing that. And
can I give you a theory?
Yeah, what is it?
My theory of why it is because the left's impulse is authoritarian, right? The whole philosophy of the left is, we, the elite in Washington or Moscow or wherever we are, know better than the ordinary Americans. Bill Buckley's idea of conservatism is, I'd rather be governed by the first 5,000 names in the Boston telephone directory than the faculty of Harvard College, which has probably never been more true than it is today, right? And,
Amen.
And the left's philosophy is, no, we'd actually like to be governed by the faculty of Harvard College. And because Harvard College knows better for America than what the 5,000 people in the Boston telephone directory decide, right? And so they want to impose their will, but they're constrained by our system. They're constrained by the safeguards. They're constrained by the institutional guardrails. They're constrained by the filibuster and all the rest of it. And Trump is the excuse to get rid of all those constraints so they can impose their Green New Deal, so they can impose their agenda, so they don't have to do the hard work of convincing the 5,000 people in the Boston telephone directory. So Trump, they don't care. This is their get out of jail free card. We can impose socialism because Donald Trump. We can pass our legislation with a simple majority instead of having to be bipartisan. We don't have to compromise. We can pack the Supreme Court. We can do all these things because Donald Trump. He's the excuse for them to do this. So they're not looking at this as a negative. This is what they want to do from the beginning. This is their philosophy writ large. And so Donald Trump is the excuse to impose their authoritarian view on the rest of the country. I don't know. Do you think that's off?
No, I think it's right. And I think that that's just another element of what we see on campuses is this, is this authoritarian impulse. You have to do what we tell you. If you don't do what we tell you, we're going to make you do it. And if it requires killing people or anything else, that's fine. So I see it everywhere, not just in the election, but everywhere. This is a problem that we've talked about in the Democratic Party that Rui Teixeira writes about all the time. The Marxist authoritarian tendency is a nightmare. We need to talk about it more. But now we need to stop talking.
Excellent. Do that.
Take care, everybody. Good to have you.
Bye. Let us know what topics you'd like us to cover. You can get in touch with the show by emailing us at whatthehell@aei.org.
Or you can reach us on Twitter. I'm at @dpletka.
And I'm at Mark Thiessen. That's Mark with a C.
Please rate and review the podcast. If you like the show, please subscribe, share it, comment on Apple Podcasts, or wherever you're listening to this.
Thanks for listening.